This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation with cultural polymath Clive James, author most recently of Opal Sunset, selected poems 1958 to 2008. Clive James is a poet, critic, essayist, novelist, journalist, broadcaster, webcaster, interviewer, songwriter, and documentarian at the very least. His new poetry collection, Opal Sunset, is his very first released in the United States. Clive, welcome to the program.
I'm very, very pleased to be here, and thank you for saying that I was all those things.
I was just going
We left out astronaut and deep-sea diver, but we can't have everything.
Of course, I should have asked if there was anything that I missed. Now, that was a pretty ungainly introduction, I realize.
It was excellent.
What I want to know is
far too flattering.
What do you call yourself? What do you?
I'm just a writer, really. Everything I do has got something to do with writing. Even when I'm just improvising on air, on radio or TV, I'm writing it in my head before I say it. And if I couldn't write, I'd be unemployable. So I'm very, very lucky to be able to do it.
So when you get grand titles labeled on you, like cultural polymath, you don't tend to think that's the right word to use?
I never quite understood what a polymath was. It sounds to me like some kind of fixative you use in the kitchen to repair pipes. I suppose it's strictly defined. It means someone who's interested in all kinds of things, but a lot of people are interested in all kinds of things. I don't think it's a very descriptive term, really. There are a lot of fields of activity that I enjoy talking about and participating in. That's true.
Now, as I just mentioned in the intro, the collection Opal Sunset, this is your first released in the U.S., and I've got to know, why did it take so long to get to the U.S.?
Well, it might have taken forever. I don't think that Norton, my publishers, would have done the book if my book, Cultural Amnesia, hadn't been a publishing success last year, and it still is. It's still going all over the world. And I think that that gave them the scope to risk the publication of a poetry book, because it's quite a big risk publishing-wise. Usually the returns aren't very lucrative, but it seems to be doing all right, which I'm very pleased. And some of the reviews were very good. There haven't been many, but they were very good, which quite stunned me. The critics seemed to get what I was doing, which is a real thrill. But the reason, when you say why did it take so long, well, there's no guarantee it would have happened at all. Most poets who publish in Britain or Australia don't get published in the U.S.
You mentioned those nice reviews, and they certainly were that. They also had a bit of a, I don't know if it was perfectly uniform, but a tone that was like, hey, Clive James can do this as well, and he's not your usual poet. What do you think separates you from the rest of the crowd?
Most reviews were saying, what a dog. He not only barks, he jumps. There was that element. I didn't mind it. But for me, poetry, of course, is central to all my activities, but there's no reason why other people shouldn't know that unless I can manage to put my poems in front of their nose. But there was that element, and I suppose the expectation, especially in the U.S., is that I'm mainly a prose writer, a cultural commentator. But for me, writing poetry has always been at the center of everything. It's my discipline, it's where I keep myself sharp, and I try and transfer poetic qualities into my prose. Poetry is the training ground, actually. It's the equivalent of doing a bar exercise every morning for a ballet dancer. You really have to keep the technique sharp. But I've always written poetry. It's probably the last thing I do as well as the first.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but when you moved from Australia to London to make your way in the world, poetry was, I believe, your primary kind of goal then, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I had a suitcase full of poems which nobody wanted. I was a total failure. For 3 years I sweated it out in London doing odd jobs and so on. And then finally in Cambridge there was the student publishing scene, and I managed to move in on that and get my stuff into print where I could see it. You don't really see a poem completely until it's in print. I think I started to sharpen up. But no, I was by no means a blazing initial success. And the long story is that it's only recently that I've come to be regarded as a genuine poet at all. It's always been thought of, especially in Britain, where I have a reputation as a TV face. It's always been regarded as a sideshow, an indulgence. It doesn't feel that way to me, but I suppose that's the way it looked. So it's only very recently that a reputation as a poet has begun to form, and people are saying nice things now, but the people who say the nice things are usually in the next generation. In my generation, I didn't get all that much approval.
Would it be too incorrect to say that the poetry club, to use a bit of a low term for it, is a very difficult one to break into and the rules are not particularly clear?
I think the best thing to do is try and go past it, which I did. I was more or less forced to anyway, because I had all these other things going on, especially in the media. And television is an automatic disqualification for seriousness in Britain. Even when I was a TV critic, it was assumed that I was actually looking down on the medium. Actually, I revered it. I love television. I love doing it. But yes, a media reputation certainly didn't help my reputation as a poet. And I didn't really count among the accepted poets until very recently. So breaking in is scarcely the word. It's I don't think I ever broke in. I just outlasted people. I waited till they died. I recommend that. Live as long as you can.
What's the fact that poetry has not been your primary career give to your actual poetry that you write? What does the fact you're so diverse?
The tremendous advantage is that I don't have a reputation to keep up, or I didn't have. I could choose to write. Well, I didn't choose to write. I wrote only from impulse. In fact, I wrote only what I couldn't choose to write. I wrote what chose me. I only wrote a poem when I had a solid impulse. So there isn't any make-weight in my work. I didn't plan poetry books the way many poets do. I simply wrote poems, and I'm a big believer in the individual poem, the standalone poem. And that's the big advantage. I wasn't tempted into overproduction. And so my work has only very slowly accumulated, and there isn't really all that much of it. And this selected poems book, Opal Sunset, is fairly comprehensive. There's about twice as much as that. That's not an awful lot of work for someone who's lived as long, but everything in it for me counts. There's nothing there I would dispense with, and there's nothing there I wrote just for the sake of it. I really wrote those poems because I had to. That's the big advantage of not being a pro in that sense. I'm a hustler rather than a pro, but yeah, the hustlers are often the best pool players. They just don't look the part.
What were the selection criteria for this book? You cut out half, you said, or you left in half. We'll say
I tried not to put in two poems on the same theme. I had to leave a few out that I thought were too firmly anchored in British or Australian detail. And most of the poems in the book that are about Britain and Australia can be readily understood by Americans without reaching for the Google machine. And there were those criteria, and also I thought they were the best. You, in your own mind, you think everything's good, but you still rank it as, well, that one I really got lucky with. You know? I tried to put in the poems I felt I really got lucky with. I think Auden once said he was dividing his own poetry up into stuff that he was quite proud of, and above that there was the stuff for which he was genuinely grateful, which meant it had been given to him. Well, I believe in that ranking. Sometimes you get hit by lightning. The great American 20th century critic and poet Randall Jarrell once said that a poet is essentially someone who hangs around waiting to be struck by lightning.
Now, do you think that you had any other big concerns as far as tailoring the collection to an American audience, besides leaving out a little bit of the more intricate bits of Australian and British culture?
I wrote an introduction for it, but I didn't spend any time talking about specific conditions in Britain and Australia. I was really talking about my beliefs that the standalone poem was the thing, and also that the formal poem had a lot to be said. I write often in forms. Sometimes I don't write in forms. Every second poem is informal, but it's written with the same attention to detail that I would use in a formal poem, and I wanted to defend the formal poem, which in America is a little bit in disrepute. I think that some of the finest poets after World War II were formal poets, Richard Wilber and Anthony Hecht. Lowell often was, or could have been, but chose not to be. But all these poets came out of a very, very strong connection with the classical tradition. Because there's another tradition in America which comes up all the way from Walt Whitman through William Carlos Williams, where the poem need have no formal shape at all. And that is meant to be a freedom. And in the case of the very best poets, it sometimes is. But I think in many ways it's a false freedom. It's very much easier to write a bad informal poem than a bad formal one. You might write a dull formal poem, but at least it satisfies its own structural criteria, whereas a bad informal poem satisfies nothing. But in America, there's no doubt that the informal poem is in the ascendant, and the formal poetry tradition always has to be restored. Possibly because some of the practitioners were so good. Richard Wilber, after World War II, was pretty hard to beat. He distorted the poetic effort of an entire generation because he was so good at it. And the same with Hecht. Hecht wrote one poem called Japan, which is, I think, one of the most exquisite poems of the 20th century, in all of literature, in fact. The trouble is with those guys is that not everyone can do it. Anyone can write a poem where you just bung anything down. Anyone can actually sound like John Asbury, which is my objection to John Asbury. John Asbury is a very competent poet, and he started off as writing the most magnificent, intricately worked formal constructions, like his poems about Daffy Duck. But then he turned into a factory, in my view, because he realized he could just put anything down, and it would be taken. If he said anything, he would be taken to mean everything. I think it's a false trail, and only the very best poets should even attempt it. And I think the thing to stick to is the discipline. Apart from the discipline only when you have to, but make the discipline the spine of your work. I can go on with this for hours because I'm preaching a lot of this stuff in a sort of poetry notebook that I'm writing episode by episode for Poetry Chicago magazine. And so I've got it all on the tip of my tongue. But I think it's a battle worth fighting right now to at least maintain the claims of the classically structured, formal poem. That doesn't mean I want to wish the other kind of poetry away. I just want equality.
It is funny you mention that because I will speak to Americans about poetry, and the reigning impression among those who don't really read much poetry is that, yes, poetry is someone putting down whatever they feel like, wherever they feel like on the page.
Well, I think it's had an unfortunate effect. Mind you, poetry was already in trouble way back early in the 20th century with modernism. Eliot and Pound were both very proud of putting poetry out of the reach of the common reader, but I think the results were catastrophic. And it was really the end of the idea that poetry could be read by anyone. It could be read only by an elite. This was definitely not true in the 19th century, neither in Britain or in America. It was poetry was a generally accepted and generally appreciated art form. Tennyson was a rock star, for example. That couldn't happen, didn't happen at any time in the 20th century after the moderns took over. It may be happening a little bit again now, when people like Billy Collins are on the scene, who are very, very good and immediately appealing. I believe in immediate appeal, by the way. I think a poem should reach you and buttonhole you with the first line. And that tradition is still very strong in Britain, mainly because Auden, who is probably the greatest talent of the 20th century after Yeats and Eliot, Auden was always very concerned that the poem should reach to your attention straight away. It was a performance. And then later on in Britain you had Philip Larkin, who did the same. Philip Larkin's poems are just unputdownable. Once you start reading one, you can't stop. And so that tradition is alive. In America, the indirect, loose, completely unstructured approach is much more common and it pays a penalty. You do get the sense that anyone could write it, and that's fatal.
In the reviews that we mentioned, I also find that there's been this recurring stripe of remark about your work. They say that James seems to be having much more fun than most poets. Did you agree with that?
Yes, it's a crime that I have to admit to committing. I've been convicted of that for a long, long time. It is thought that anyone who is obviously having so much fun can't be serious. I dispute that. I think the seriousness and sheer pleasure and enjoyment can be coexistent. But I can see why people take that view. But I'm not going to put on a solemn face just to dodge the accusation. If sometimes a joke is the fastest way of saying something, and the most compressed way, and the most resonant way.
We've talked about what your work in other fields gives your poetry. What does your work in poetry give your work in other fields, your essays, your criticism?
I think it transmits to everything. It certainly transmits into prose. I write a lot of criticism and critical essays. I wrote a big book of nothing else, Cultural Amnesia. And every line of that book is shaped by the fact that I write poetry as a vocation. Poetry teaches you to watch your words, to make every word count, to unpack every metaphor, to make sure that it checks out. You don't mix your metaphors if you've examined every word in them. There's all kinds of disciplines that transfer from poetry to prose, in my view, and into every other field. Even when I went on television, I was writing my own television scripts for my documentaries, and for my weekly show, I would write all the material in the first section before the guests came on, and so on. I shaped it very, very carefully, word by word, to poetic standards. I hope I didn't sound like Swinburne reciting with a lily in his hand, but that was the idea. It was to really make the words count, and poetry is at the center of all that.
And in reading Cultural Amnesia, tell me if I'm completely wrong on this point, but what I get from the text is that you have so much respect for someone who does write in prose and yet captures a truth that is almost sense experience with a single sentence of their prose. Am I just mangling my words?
I love the aphorism as a form. I wouldn't want to write entirely in aphorisms, but some of the best prose writers are aphoristic. It really starts with Montaigne and Pascal, and it goes on right through English and German and French. There's usually a point, even in a philosopher, where he or she, they have to sum the argument up. They've gone on for a couple of pages and been laying out the argument. They'll try to do one sentence that gets it all in. That's the sentence I pounce on. And it crops up all the time, even in the greatest philosophers, and people like Croce. Benedetto Croce was a big influence on me. He's not much read in English anymore, but he was the ideal philosopher for someone who is trying to push the view that the creative impulse is basic to mankind. First art, then everything else. Everyone wants to make something, and Croce seized on that. He didn't think the art was the higher mental activity. He thought it was the basic mental activity. And he could put that into a nutshell. Now, I usually look around to see what they've said in a nutshell, but your prose would be indigestible if it was all epigrams. And I also try to lay out an argument with perfect clarity, and you have to practice that. If you've ever been an editor or known an editor, the editor will tell you that almost every manuscript that comes in from a young writer has to be unknotted, unpacked. You have to get the writer in beside you and say, look, you need 2 sentences here, not one. And don't try and say so much at once. Say one thing after the other. It all has to be taught. And eventually you get to where you can teach yourself. And after about 50 years, you start getting good at it.
Only takes 50 years, huh?
About that. Yes. I'm not much a believer in the virtue of youth in the arts. I do like to think that there's no young man's version of the stuff I'm doing now. I had to live this long in order to write it. Because I might have been unusually stupid. That's quite possible. I'm a very slow learner, and I learn by trial and error. But trial and error gives you material to work with. And all the other things I do, like television and radio and journalism, they give me things to work with. I go to strange places, I meet people, or I did when I was, for 20 years I was in the air almost all the time, going all over the world making documentaries. I saw a lot of stuff, I was forced into situations, I was brought out of myself. And I use all that now for material for my work. But always your first alertness is to the language. And I think it helps to read a couple of foreign languages if you can. I think the universities should teach that instead of literary theory. It's a very common theme of mine, and one that makes me very unpopular in the universities when I say that cultural theory, cultural studies is largely a waste of time. What students should be studying is culture, not cultural theory. They should be spending more time learning French than reading Derrida in English.
Now, which languages exactly have you got? I know English, German, French, some Japanese, Russian. I know I'm leaving some.
Yeah, but there's a reading acquaintances. I can't stay out of jail in any language, possibly English, and a bit of Italian. But to speak another language is a full-time job. But to read another language at the literary level is not impossible. It's easier, for example, to read essays than it is to read novels in any language, because the essays are speaking an international language of criticism, whereas the novel gets into specific detail about what's in the kitchen. But I have a fairly fluent reading knowledge of the major European languages: French, German, Italian, Spanish, and I did read quite a lot of Russian at one stage, although it's all gone now. I have to get it back soon, by the way. And I've got a long way with Japanese, but it's the kind of language where you have to work on it all the time, because it's not designed to be read by adults. It's designed to be learned by children and used by adults. It's not designed to be learned by adults. It's very, very difficult. But the European languages are comparatively easy, especially if you've got a bit of Latin. And I don't see why the colleges shouldn't teach them and insist on them, one or two. I'm not asking for the world. I know it's a knack. I know not everybody's got it. But a lot of people would find they did have it if they weren't wasting their time reading impossible theoretical works about hermeneutics and structuralism and stuff that really doesn't mean much about anything.
You take me back to the interview I did with Alan Sokol, the perpetrator of the infamous Sokol hoax on postmodernism.
It was a very funny book, and I love that book, but, really, it wasn't really necessary for anyone who'd already made his own mind up about what I call the French intellectual cabaret, the kick line. It should have been obvious that they were all talking nonsense. But anyway, that book exposed that they were talking nonsense.
There's a line that I really liked that I read from you, that you said you perhaps prefer to produce or enjoy reading, or maybe both, poems with essay content and essays with poetic content. I like that, but I'm not completely sure what a poem...
Well, I think the two forms are very close. They certainly are in my mind. I set out to write a poem as if it's got an argument. Sometimes I have to discover the argument. It will end up with an argument. And I set out to write an essay to make every word count and hang together. I think the two impulses are very close. But I don't like the kind of poetry that doesn't really have a meaning. And I don't like the kind of essay that's all effect. And I think one form influences the other. It does for me, anyway. And it doesn't mean that I sit down and start to write and can't decide yet whether it's an essay or a poem. I know the difference. But the two things are not all that far apart. Most severe criticisms of my poetry, which are advanced, and they still are, is that the poems are too like essays. I really should let myself go and explore language. I'm not interested in exploring language. I'm interested in exploring experience. Well, I don't think poems are made of wordplay.
We discussed earlier how you have the freedom to wait for that lightning to strike that a poet needs. Now, what happens to the poets that don't have that freedom?
Well, that's tough, and you have to take an extreme case. In Australia, for example, the very, very important contribution to poetry, especially in the 20th century, and continuing into this one, was made by women who were housewives. The two-career family had not yet arrived. Their job was to run the house. They wrote poetry in their spare time, and there wasn't much of it. I can remember my mother took 4 or 5 days a week just to do the housework, because you had to boil the washing, and there just wasn't much time. But some of the women poets in Australia found the time to write poems, and some of them were very important. Gwen Harwood was an important poet. Judith Wright was another. There are several more. They did magnificent work, and mainly because they learned to think while they worked. And then in the time that they had, they would write it down and work on it. And I think that's an instruction to us all. You can find time to write poetry. I never find time when I'm not writing poetry. I use my downtime anyway. It's a trick I learned when I first got into television full-time in the 80s. Television involves a lot of waiting, especially if you're shooting abroad. If you're out on location, you spend a lot of time sitting in the car, sometimes for hours. Well, I didn't want to waste that time, so I was either reading or I was writing. And that is the time when I worked on a poem. There's always time. And when most young writers ask me, how do you do it? Well, I said, the first thing you do is get up in the morning. Really get up early, get a day's work done before breakfast. Then you'll get the bulge on the other guys. But if you spend the whole morning getting out of bed, there's no excuse. It's work. And the big trick about writing, and especially about writing poetry, waiting for the lightning, is that you've got to make the time so that you can wait, because sometimes it won't come. So the great thing to have, if you can, is a good whole day with nothing else happening. Then it mightn't come until 5 o'clock. It mightn't come at all, but it mightn't come till late in the day. And the big trick of being a pro is not to panic while you're waiting. Waiting is part of it. While you're waiting, something's going on in your head. Sometimes it goes on in your sleep. You've got a problem in your writing, go to sleep on it. Next morning it might be clear. But there's time. Where you're really short of time is life itself. It's too short. I'm going to be 70 next year, and I object. I would like another 30 years, starting now, please. If you could fix that up, I'd be grateful.
We know you in the U.S. primarily as a critic, and now your poetry has made it here, of course, but why do we only know you as a critic? I rattled off the things that you were at the beginning, and yet criticism is the main thing you have in the U.S.
Well, TV was TV that I was doing in Britain didn't really transport to the U.S. I did one big series called Fame in the 20th Century, and I think PBS ran it twice everywhere on the network. But PBS is only a small audience. And some of my documentaries got into individual PBS stations, never on the network. So I was never a TV presence in the U.S. And, of course, that that kind of exposure does change things. In Australia, all my programs that I made in Britain went on the air in Australia. So it's immediate recognition. The trouble is that kind of recognition factor is a prison, because it stamps that image on you, and it's very hard to shake it off. My advantage in the U.S. is people don't know that I'm an entertainer, so it's easier for me to be serious and to be taken seriously. And I get on TV and talk to Bill Moyers because he knows me as a critic. He knows me as a TV critic. He knows me as a critic generally. If he'd seen me clowning around on British television, he might have thought differently. So in many ways, it's a liberation. I think you've got to have a sense of proportion about the American market, the American audience. It's huge. It's so huge that you should look for your minority and go for that. And I've got a feeling from the way cultural amnesia is received, that there's an audience on its way up among the young, especially of college age, who are a bit disillusioned with what the university system has become, who want to really know what it's all about, what all this creativity really is, and I can reach them. But I wouldn't say that was the whole of America. And you're not going to be Geraldo. An awful lot of people who are prominent in Britain dream of making it big in America. They would be very lucky to make it small in America. America isn't like that. Being big in America involves doing something that all Americans want. You want to be Brad Pitt, you have to be in great big movies. So people have got the whole thing backwards, but they can't resist it because America is so magnetic. And there's the simple fact that you'll never be world famous unless you're famous in America first. And some people want world fame. I don't particularly care about it. I just want everyone in the world to read my books. You know that wonderful thing Gore Vidal once said? Somebody once asked him why he worked so hard to promote his books. And he said, none must escape.
None must escape.
None must escape.
This drives at an issue. There's an issue you wrote at in an essay that it was defining celebrity, I believe, versus recognition. And you have some of both. In what proportion do you have celebrity and recognition?
Well, I had a lot of celebrity when I was on television full time, up until about the year 2000, early 2001, which is when I walked away. Too much of it. People would call me by my first name in the street, and it's quite eerie, in fact. Well, that's starting to fade now, thank heavens. Recognition is something different. Recognition is someone's read your book, read your poem, they might want to congratulate you on it. That's recognition. It's quite different from celebrity. Celebrity is a kind of Western disease, which I suppose we'll have to cure ourselves of. But it's also quite fun, and it's a language. I was looking for a metaphor for the unlikely today. I was writing an essay, and I was saying somebody suggested something was possible, and I said, well, it's possible that Paris Hilton has read all 3 volumes of Shelby Foote's History of the American Civil War. It's just not likely. Now, that wouldn't work if Paris Hilton wasn't what she was. So we use it. It's a language. It's a set of tokens. Of course, it can get out of control, and it can affect American elections. Turning politicians into rock stars is probably not the best idea.
There was a remark you made a while ago about why you were famous for some things in America, other things in Britain and Australia. You say that in America we don't like our humor mixed in with our seriousness.
No.
Why do you think
I
that might be?
America is essentially a market, not just a market culture, but a supermarket culture, in which the label says what's in the can. There's one label, one can. One label marked serious criticism on one can. Another label marked poetry on one can. Another marked humor, spelled in the American way, Humor, on another can. And Americans on the whole don't like it when there are 2 labels on the one can. It introduces a sort of category problem. I think it's simply part of the culture. Britain is, and to a lesser extent Australia, are much more, subtle is the wrong word, mixed in that way. You can have 2 things going on at once. You can be ironically funny and very serious, for example, at the same time, and not get misconstrued. You can try it in America, and you get into real trouble doing that.
This is 2 tones going at once. What about the friendliness of the, let's just say, the sides of the pond toward the fact that you are also many things at once? As I listed off all that stuff, typically, do you think America wants one label as far as that goes as well?
Well, that's true, and it would be difficult for me to operate the way that I have in the U.S. I think there are people who have done it, but they tend to get pushed into a corner. A great example for me was Dick Cavett. I think Dick Cavett was the supreme TV host, but he could be serious and funny at the same time, and that made him suspect. And eventually, I think, in the long run, it affected his career. He probably wouldn't like me saying so. He had a triumphant career, and I know him well, and I adore him. But there's no question that his relationship to the networks was made that much more difficult by the fact that he was hard to classify. I don't think I could have lived the life I had and done the kind of thing I've done in the U.S., although I would have enjoyed it trying, because I'm very much at home in the U.S. My problem is I'm too at home in the U.S. I only have to be off the plane at Kennedy for like 2 hours, or in L.A., and already my accent is changing, and I could sort of recognize the Hershey bars, and the whole thing is familiar to me, probably because it all came to me in the movies when I was a kid in Australia. But I just love it. I relax in America. I think the Czech film director Miloš Forman, great director, he once said a very true thing. He said, there are only two places in the world where you're at home and in America. And you do feel at home in America, and I feel very much at home. The trouble is I'm too at home. I like going on TV, going on radio, being interviewed. In New York, I would be doing that all the time. I'd never get anything done. When I'm in Los Angeles, I'm dreaming of writing a screenplay within 10 minutes of getting off at LAX. Suddenly, I could spend my life sitting beside the swimming pool, writing screenplays for films that would never get made. Second wife, third car, fourth house. It's all there. Unfortunately, it's in my blood. It's in my tooth. I got a sweet tooth for America, and I wouldn't get enough work done. And Britain is a bit more austere. In many ways, it's still World War II in Britain. It's still rationed, and it suits me.
If you're just tuning in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas from Colin Marshall Radio. At colinmarshallradio.com, you'll find our complete interview archive, other podcasts, and more. My guest is cultural polymath Clive James, author of, most recently, Opal Sunset, Selected Poems 1958 to 2008. That Dick Cavett chapter in Cultural Amnesia that you wrote is one of my very favorites of the book, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, the implication seemed to be about the wrap-up of his television career that Cavett had TV success, but couldn't handle having primarily TV success in his life. Now,
I've got a feeling that might be true. Dick is a very complicated guy. He's very clever, and with his friend Chris Porterhouse, they put together one of the best books about show business, which is called Dick Cavett. It's a riveting book. And I've got a feeling that he would have done more writing. He's doing writing now for the New York Times, John. He would have done a lot more, but he felt that TV had him prisoner. So he was actually fighting his own existence, which is a tricky position to be in. But I admire him a great deal. I think I probably would have been in the same position some way in the States. Some of the American TV stars, they were really self-crucified by their fame. People I very much admire, like Ernie Kovacs, for example. Of course, he died in an accident, but I think he would have eventually got into trouble anyway. He was simply too intelligent for for the kind of reception he was getting. But I'm stunned by the creativity of American television now. Don't forget, everything has changed in the last 20 years. Back in, I think it was early 80s, William Shawn was still editor of The New Yorker, and he gave me a big hint that I might come to New York and be TV critic for The New Yorker. And there were two reasons I couldn't do it. One is my family was in Britain and I wanted to stay there. The other main reason was that there simply wasn't enough American TV to talk about. The networks were all there was in those days. The networks were devoting prodigies of resources to producing practically nothing. And nobody thought that would ever change. And then it changed because of cable and HBO. HBO set new standards, the networks had to follow, and where HBO went, eventually NBC would do The West Wing, and then there was a whole power shift, which is still going on, by which the American long-running series, would you call it a series in the States? A serial, like big Band of Brothers, for example.
Yeah, it's a series.
Well, Band of Brothers is actually better than Saving Private Ryan. When Hanks came out of Saving Private Ryan, he knew exactly what to do, and so did Spielberg, which is to do the TV serial. And the results were stunning. And those big American box sets, now I watch them all the time. I've just gone through Californication, Entourage, 30 Rock. I think so much of Tina Fey. And Tina Fey came right out of Saturday Night Live, and she does 30 Rock. And TV has become an incubator. And it was much harder in a previous era. Someone like Richard Benjamin, who I thought was a genius. Richard Benjamin and Paula Prentice, what a combination. Paula Prentice was simply my favorite TV actress. But they did not have the opportunities then to do what can be done now. So there's been a shift, a cultural shift of the kind I love to analyze. I love to write about that kind of stuff.
Do you find that this is as good a time for non-fiction television as it is for fictional TV?
I guess so. It's certainly a good time in Britain. Britain's TV is widely thought to have gone to the dogs because of reality TV. The British channels are simply full of Big Brother houses, full of people you don't want to meet. I don't know if you've seen any of this stuff or whether you have the equivalent, but it's just scarifying. It's not only boring, it's disgusting. And people think that TV is over, but in fact, some of the best documentary TV Britain has ever done is being produced now. Some of the historical series that are coming out of the BBC are just wonderful. So there's always room for the quirky stuff. Whether that goes on in the States, I don't know. The TV in America has always been unbalanced by the fact that PBS is underfunded. The quite opposite is true in Britain. BBC is hugely funded. In fact, the commercial channels protest at the BBC's power. In the US, it's exactly backwards, and I think it was a terrible error that was made in Washington by contesting political forces. They combined somehow to bury the full possibilities of public service broadcasting. And it's out of public service broadcasting that the best factual stuff usually comes, is it not?
I take it when it comes to media, you are not a free market libertarian.
I'm a free market ideologist to a certain extent. To the extent that I think a free market is basic to democracy, but I don't believe in an unregulated free market, and nor does anybody else. The credit crunch has told you that without the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Fed, it would have been 1929. Of course you must have regulation. I do believe in enlightened government interference. Britain had a very, very strong broadcasting system before it was deregulated by Margaret Thatcher, and the deregulation made it into a much more open market, and the result was a decline in standards. Now, I believe in enlightened regulation of a burgeoning, creative, cultural economy. I believe in these two things at once, which again is hard in the States. But it's there by implication in the philosophy of someone like John Rawls. In fact, there's no one like John Rawls. John Rawls is a great man who gave a lot of thought to justice in a free society. And pluralism is not only desirable, it's necessary. But the government simply must do things to keep things civilized. The question is whether the government can do things to keep things civilized and where the government is. And the U.S. government is much more complicated. America isn't just run from the White House, it's run from the Congress. In Britain, things are much simpler.
Now, this radio program is both broadcast traditionally over the airwaves, literally the airwaves, and it's also distributed as a podcast on the internet worldwide. And it intrigues me that you've made the move from television into, I guess, webcasting, we'd call it, video podcasting with conversation, talking in the library, the Clive James show, whatever.
Oh, I'm flattered that you've seen it. My website is very important to me. It's only just becoming known now. It's taken me 5 years to build it. I had the idea in the late 90s when I was still in television full-time, but I saw the first successful webcast in about 1996. There was a little moving picture on the screen. It was about the size of a postage stamp. It stuttered, it fumbled, but I knew instantly that was the future. And I started planning a multimedia website right then. Little did I know that it couldn't be built. There was no possibility of building a multimedia website because narrowband didn't offer enough bandwidth. But while I was planning, somebody invented broadband, and it all did become possible. That's where ignorance can sometimes help. And after 2001, I started to build the thing. And my aim is to make it a sort of cultural center, and I'm running all my programs on it. I'm trying to get my old programs, even when I don't own the rights. I'll try and steal from myself, and put them on the screen, and eventually it's going to be a critical guide to everything I find valuable all over the web, because the web is infinite. So what you're really doing is editing infinity. I've got a new thing going now where I actually write little essays about things that I find vital on YouTube. YouTube is already colossal. I think 16 hours of new material is added every day or something wild. But nobody can find their way through all that. So you have to go to someone who says, look here, look, you haven't heard this, you've never heard Les Paul and Mary Ford playing and singing How High the Moon in 1951, you haven't? Look here. You write a little essay and they go. So that's what I'm going to be doing in the next few years. Whether it'll be time to develop it to its full potential, well, I know they won't. But I'll build something that the next generation can take over. I'm already choosing my young future captains. But I'm a big believer in trying to create an oasis in the web, because the web is, to mix a metaphor, the web is a jungle. So you don't want an oasis in a jungle, you want a clearing. There's got to be some places where people can come and know they'll find nothing except quality. So that's what I'm going to try to do, and I've made a start.
It does seem that we share a goal as far as wanting to distribute the best conversation possible far and wide. Your own series, Talking in the Library. I've been watching it for quite some time and looking at the season 6 guests with Tom Stoppard and Melvin Bragg. I just thought, well, I'm going to have to throw in my own towel now because he's landed all of these guys. But
well, they'll probably want to talk to you too, and because it's such an easy, relaxed, and friendly and accommodating form. It's not like big-time studio stuff. You're not surrounded by masses of concrete. You don't have to wait around for hours. Just come in off the street and do it. Stoppard, whom I know well, just walked in and sat down and we talked. And then fed him some dinner afterwards. He loved the whole idea. All kinds of writers have done that with me. Martin Amis, Julian Barnes, Ian McEwan. Kate Blanchett walked in, sat down, and for an hour she was just fascinating. If you had to bring her in through a television studio and make her up first, she would have charged you $20 million. She did it for nothing. You see the difference. It's just a whole new world.
How much less complicated is this operation? Because, of course, it's right there in your home, is it not?
Yeah, I'm right here in my living room. It's getting less complicated all the time. I keep changing allies. I work with 2 different cable stations. I've worked with Times Online. My eventual aim, and I've already told them this, is to do it all myself. Get a couple of mini cams, and the technology is almost there. It'll get to the point where you can get 2 amateurs to point cameras at you and do the whole thing and edit while you go. And the costs sink all the time because it's a very competitive market. The only governing factor is the quality of the talk, the quality of the people. And that's where it comes in handy to have been around a few decades, because you know them. I can ring them up.
And what's fascinating is that it's been not just better for you as the host of the show to be able to do it out of your own home, but it has actually elicited better talk from the guest to be in a non-studio.
I think so too. I'm not so sure I've been better, because I used to prepare very, very thoroughly on TV, and maybe I've got a little bit loose, but I like the chancy conversation. I could never do the chancy conversation on TV. You had to plan it because you're on the air. You had a 28-minute slot or something. It had to fit. This way I can be looser and just wing it. And people like Stoppard, for example, react very well to that. They don't like being in a tight, planned situation. They don't like the pre-interview and being prepped. They like to just speak. I had a great moment just a couple of days ago. I was out walking on the river just near my place. My apartment is on the south bank of the Thames, just near Tower Bridge. And Patrick Stewart lives around here, the Starfleet Admiral.
Oh, yes.
Mighty actor, by the way. He's a mighty Shakespearean actor as well. And there he was, and we knew each other vaguely, and I bumped into each other. I did the unforgivable thing. I said, I'm running this thing. Would you come in and talk to me? He said, yes. And we'll be fixing that up in the next few days, and I can't wait. And it's as casual as that, Whether this will become a universal thing, I don't know. But it's certainly, for me, it's more fun than television, and I agree with you. I think the results are better. Do you think that good conversation has migrated into the internet almost completely at this point, or is there still? I think it might do that. There's always going to be a place for face-to-face on network television, provided it's not overproduced or overdesigned. Talking to Bill Moyers, I really enjoyed it. I love Bill anyway, and it was just a fabulous conversation. The British equivalent would not have been so good, because the British TV is always over-designed. The British TV producers have always felt that TV should be a spectacle, and TV is not a spectacle. Movies are a spectacle. TV, especially when there are faces concerned, is face-to-face. Go in on the head, stay on the head. Don't worry about the set. The British will never learn that. The Americans have always been ahead there. But I don't know how it will balance out eventually. Mainstream TV, I think, is always going to be there. What's happening in Britain is that the stuff that the mainstream TV channels used to run that was, shall we say, cultural, in the sense that the grandees that ran British TV after the World War II were out to enlighten the public. They've got to pay the public back for all the stress they've been through and for the near collapse of civilization by making life better. On network TV, you would have entertainment, and then suddenly you'd surprise them with an opera or something. And that went on for a long time. It's gone now. There's very, very much less chance now that you'll run into something that, well, what's the word, enlightening on mainstream television. That's moved off the main channels onto the subsidiary channels, and from there it goes to the cable channels, and finally it goes to the net. Everything will always be there. It's just you have to go and look for it. The days when it came and looked for you are over. That's the big change.
And in terms of finding, this broadens out much more generally, finding what's good, what is the finest in culture. How much is that your goal? These days it seems to be a huge amount of it, with as far as looking at cultural amnesia, looking at your website. How much do you think your job is?
I think the thing to do is to point to what you think is vital. So you're editing infinity. It's a phrase I'm getting increasingly fond of using. But I don't know everything, and no one can know everything. But I know a few things that are good, so you point the way to the next generation coming. I remember what it was like when I was first a student. The sheer excitement of it and the bewilderment, because there was so much. What to listen to next? Who was this guy Bartok? What were Beethoven's late quartets? I hadn't heard the early quartets, and so on. And it was always helpful to know someone who knew where to put the needle down. It's an expression I often use after I got to London in the early 60s. I was a roommate with an Australian record executive who was an opera fan, and I knew nothing about Wagner. And he would put an LP on the turntable, and he would put the needle down in exactly the right place, the moment that you couldn't miss. It was obviously beautiful. And those bits are very, very seldom near the edge of the record. You've got to know where to put the needle down. And that's really what I do. When young people say to me, well, I'm so glad you told me about that, I never would have gone there, that's when I get my moment of satisfaction.
It's a young audience that you prefer with your works these days?
I like reaching the young. I love it when the young reach me. And I get a lot of that. I get letters, and people find me in the street. When I'm sitting in the cafe writing, as I still do, people, young poets will come up and show me their poetry and so on. And sometimes it's boring, but often it's fascinating. And there's always this thing going on where if you give them a tip, they're going to go away and act on it. I know that because I did when I was young. Somebody would say one thing. I was once pontificating, it was in my first years in Fleet Street, I was pontificating about Thomas Mann and how nobody had to read those long novels. And an editor who I thought was actually a very, very obscure man, actually, he hardly ever said much. He said, no, Thomas Mann is a very great writer. He said, what you should do is start with something small like Death in Venice. So I went off and I did that. And over the next 20 or 30 years, I read all of Thomas Mann. It probably started at that moment. You never know when something will start, so that's why you have to be responsible and say what you mean. And don't equivocate about what's good and what's bad. If something's good, say it's good.
And reading Cultural Amnesia, I seem to find that, correct me if I'm wrong, but you are not one of those people who reaches a certain age and then says, this young generation, they've got it all wrong. We had it right when we were young.
No, I used to be in the young generation myself, and I'm still quite fond of the idea. And I love the way they're going now. I meet some bright kids, I've just enrolled a new writer among my guest writers on the website, and she's about as sharp as anyone I've met. She's going to go everywhere, and she'll be doing it on the web. She's a child of the web. And I'm just there to see them off, but God knows where they're going. But I just know that they're clever and they want to know everything, and I recognize the hunger.
Do you encourage the same generalism that you have always had?
Yes, and in a sense, I think you should be specific over a wide range. I don't think you should be blurred. I think you should really go for it. If you want to read Hemingway, read all of Hemingway. Find out everything about it. Then move on. But yeah, sure, I do. And I would do that into science, too. I'm going to open up a science section of my website the year after next. There's going to be no time in 2009. But in 2010, I want a science editor, and we start putting up all the best articles about scientific subjects that there are in the world. will go onto the website too. Guides to them, précis of them, critical introductions. It's a critical website. Yes, I'll do that. And that's about as general as you can get. If you can get the arts and the sciences in the one frame, the one creative frame, which they are. They're in the frame of creativity. They're in the frame of what human beings do that was not in the world before humans. If you can do that, then you're doing the job, I think.
You're paying a bit of an homage to C.P. Snow in that regard.
Well, C.P. Snow's only crime was dullness. He was one of the dullest writers in the world. He was generally right about the two cultures. He just had a way of putting it that made you wish he was wrong.
I like that. Now, earlier we touched very briefly on a project like Cultural Amnesia, providing what academia may be failing to provide. How does academia fail, to your mind? Mainly through a intellectual aberration, which is called theory in general, or cult stud. This is only in the humanities, and it's only localized. It's just a part of the college that went wrong and started going wrong quite a while back. Mainly it came out of Paris. The French intellectuals after World War II simply didn't want to deal with reality. They wanted to deal with fantasy because reality had been too terrible and too compromising. And cultural theory started to grow up. And the trouble with it, it was very, very portable. Because when you talk cultural theory, there's no good and bad. Anyone can get a job. None of it means anything. And there's no way of ranking anybody. So if you can get tenure, you've got tenure for life. And unfortunately, it has a devastating effect on the students because they learn nothing, or else fatally they learn to do the same thing. It will pass. I think it's probably already passing. But a couple of generations of students have pretty well had culture ruined for them by cultural theory. Is that sort of theory one of the great sort of faux simplifiers that you, I don't know if rail against is the word, but that you combat? It's very closely related to ideology. It actually grew out of left-wing ideology, much more than right-wing. There were two great waves of ideology in the 20th century, and cultural studies grew out of the left wing. It's one of the places the left went after the whole idea that there could be a totalitarian alternative to Western society became untenable, when it was revealed just how horrible the Soviet Union and communist China had been. The left didn't collapse. It transferred its attention into culture, into various other activities. I speak as a left-winger, by the way. I was born and raised on the left, and I'll die on the left. But what's happened to the left-wing ideologists has been a real poser, and I'm still dealing with it. It's one of the things I write about all the time. I've got another book of essays coming out in the middle of next year. It's called The Revolt of the Pendulum, and that's going to be one of its subjects. It's an ever-present subject. And you mentioned earlier you've got to get your Russian back soon. Is there a Russian project you've got on the way as well? Yeah, quietly, although it's not as important as getting my Japanese back, because I have a big plan, if I live long enough, to write a novel about the war in the Pacific, and a big novel, and I want to tell it from both sides. That means getting right back into the Japanese frame of mind and the Japanese language. The language is the secret of Japan. It's probably the secret of any country is the local language, but in Japan it really is the secret. It makes everybody in Japan a connoisseur because one page of a Japanese newspaper is a work of art. It's a tremendously visually satisfactory language. It's beautiful, in fact, and I have to get back into it. Russian I simply enjoy, and I quit too early. I've got to get back to it. But it's quite easy because all you have to do is pick up Tolstoy and start reading him again. And you can start with The Three Bears, because Tolstoy, since Russian culture in general really began only in the early 19th century, all the fairy stories are written by people like Pushkin and Tolstoy. The Three Bears in Russian is by Tolstoy, so you're reading Tolstoy within the first 2 weeks. And what else is on the horizon for you? It feels like anything you mention is going to be a surprise to me about what you're working on. Well, I've got my work cut out for far too long ahead. I can't possibly do it all. But that's better than the other thing. I never wanted to lie down on my laurels. Maybe they weren't enough laurels. Maybe they were too sharp. But I never wanted to do it. And I've only gradually became clear in my mind about what I should do. It horrifies me that it took so long. But it did. And maybe it's all the better for it. At least I've got a long life to reflect on.
I just wish there was time. But that's impossible, and part of being a mature, grown-up adult is to accept that and use time well. I suppose that impulse comes from the fact that when I was young, my father didn't get back from the war. My mother had a hard time, and I suppose I saw wasted possibilities, and I think I owed it to them to try and do as much as I could.
And speaking of the grains through the hourglass, we are coming up toward the end of the hour. The book, once again, is Opal Sunset, Selected Poems 1958 to 2008, the current book from Clive James. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the program.
I enjoyed it so much, and thank you so much for reading the book.
To find out more about Clive James and his work, visit clivejames.com. Our music is produced by Ben Althouse. Hear more of his work at benalthouse.com. And for our complete show archive, other podcasts, and more, visit colinmarshallradio.com.